In March of 2003, when I was 17, my younger brother and I took a weekend camping trip up to the Los Padres National Forest. We had gone there many times with our family for day camping, swimming, and just lounging around. This time we went alone for a 2-night camping trip at our favorite spot that most locals simply call the Gorge. We will never forget this weekend, but for all the wrong reasons. We got there Saturday morning at around 9 a.m. and hiked the 5 miles out to the Gorge. The Gorge is a large swimming hole with a huge 60-foot rock cliff boulder that visitors love to jump from into the deep water below. The jumping rock cliff is very steep and one must jump in a specific location below to ensure that they do not hit the rocks protruding from the wall face. The Gorge has many primitive camping areas and is overall a beautiful yet isolated place. The first day was very fun, and after a long day of swimming, catching crawdads, jumping from rocks, and just relaxing, we set up our tent, made a fire, and ate our cans of SpaghettiOs and the few crawdads we had cooked for dinner. Towards the end of dinner, we were visited by a large group of students who were camping farther down the river. They stated they were students from the Bay Area who had a few nights left in their almost 2-week-long school camping trip. We offered them some of our chips and snacks and chatted for a bit with them before they made their hike back to their camping spot. It soon got dark and my brother and I got ready for bed. My brother was 2 years younger than I and had a deep fear of isolation, so we slept in the same tent and agreed that we would keep our fire burning the entire night to ease his anxiety. We put 5 large logs in the fire and crept inside our tent and got into our sleeping bags. We both fell asleep very fast as we were exhausted from the day. Around 2:30 in the morning, we were both awoken by a large splash of water near our tent that put out our fire. We heard no voices and could not see much from inside our tent. We froze in terror. My brother began to cry and I tried to calm him down. I told him that I would go outside to investigate and that everything would be okay. I told him that our water bladder must have fallen from the tree where we had hung it and that I'm sure it was some kind of a coincidence. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped our tent, and stepped outside. I pointed the flashlight over the fire pit and saw 4 large men sitting around our fireplace, all staring at me with what I can only describe as expressionless faces. It appeared as though they had slit open our 2-gallon water bladder that we had hanging over a tree and had thrown it into our fire. I was in shock and didn't know what to say. For about 5 seconds none of them said anything. We just stared at each other. Then one of them said in a very drunk voice, "Get your pussy friend over here." I then heard my brother hyperventilating and screaming and crying in our tent in a way that made me feel so helpless. I had no weapons and my brother and I were outnumbered 2 to 1. I asked the men what they wanted and told them that we could just leave and that we were sorry we had taken their camping spot or invaded their area or whatever. They ignored my question and just stood up. That's when I saw that 2 of the 4 men were holding something in their hands. Long, sword-shaped in appearance. It was like a machete or a small sword, but they looked very homemade and primitive. The men yelled at us to get up and to bring our pussy asses with them. I thought for a second that these might be drunk rangers getting mad at us for having too big of a fire, but once I glanced at their clothing and saw their baggy jean pants and their big and gray hoodie type clothing, I knew we weren't that lucky. I had heard in the past that drug dealers or the Mexican cartel had been caught hiding large amounts of marijuana plants in the forest, and I wondered if these men were some of the men who somehow felt that we were a threat to their crops. I was in fear for our lives. The men did not touch us to threaten us directly with violence, but I definitely felt an implied threat in their tone and believed that we really had no choice in the matter. My brother, who was still crying, and I followed the lead male while the other 3 men fell back behind us. My brother put his hand on my shoulder and was visibly shaking. He then whispered to me that they were walking in the direction of the 60-plus foot rock cliff and that we needed to run. I was petrified and had not been paying attention to where they were leading us, but I realized that he was right. I stopped dead in my tracks and said to the men, "What are you going to do to us?" The lead male stated in a slurred voice, "Nothing, we're just going to have some fun with you pussies." I felt as though we really had no other choice but to do what they said and hope they were just merely screwing with us and that this would all be over soon. After about 30 seconds of walking, we arrived at the jumping spot on top of the boulder overlooking the gorge swimming area. One of the men then stated, "Have you guys ever jumped from here?" I told them yes, I had, but my brother had not, and it was a pretty high jump and very dangerous for most people due to the height and the rocks below. The men laughed and again called my brother a pussy. I told them that we were not pussies, as I had jumped from the spot before, but it was not safe to do it in the dark. The men then formed a half circle around us, and one of the men said, "I want to see. Show us you're not a bunch of pussies." I screamed at them that it was too dangerous at night, and that during the day it was dangerous enough. I told them that there were many rocks down there that you have to avoid, and that if you did not jump correctly, then that jump could kill you. I pleaded and pleaded. The men just laughed and took a few steps closer to us. I was beyond scared and could hear my heart beating through my ears. My brother, by this point, was crying loudly and saying things I could not understand. He was beyond terrified, and so was I. I grabbed his hand and told him that we needed to get away from these men, as we were in great danger. I told him that I had jumped off the boulder into the water before and knew where to jump, and that if he jumped with me, that we would be okay. I told him I would use my flashlight to help guide us, and that I would tell him where to put his feet and how far to jump. The men laughed at us as we had our conversation and showed zero humanity or pity for us. I held my brother's hand and placed his feet with my hand onto a specific place on the rock ledge where I remembered jumping from the last time I was there months before. I explained to him that I knew he was scared, and so was I, but we needed to jump out as far as we can and slightly to the right, otherwise we could hit the rocks. He was shaking, crying, and kept telling me that he couldn't do it. He then urinated on the floor. The men laughed and kept saying they couldn't believe what a bunch of pussies we were. I then told my brother we needed to jump now, and that if he would be okay if he listened to me. I told him that after we jumped, that we would swim to the shore on the right and would hide in the bushes until daybreak and go for help then. I then grabbed his hand tightly and told him that when we hit the water, he needed to tuck his legs and arms in so they would not get hurt from the impact of the water. And I instructed him that he needed to swim hard to the surface, as we would sink pretty far down due to the height we were jumping from. I grabbed his hand and we jumped. I pulled him hard with me to ensure that he would be safe from the rocks below, and that he jumped far enough out. We fell for what seemed like a minute, but it was only a few seconds in reality. My brother yelled all the way down in a way I had never heard another human being before. Terror, dread, and fear of imminent death reverberated from his voice. I felt helpless and almost forgot where we were for those few seconds. Then we hit the water. As soon as we hit, I lost my grip on my brother's hand, but I did hear a second impact in the water. I swam up towards the surface with all my energy and took a deep breath. I then listened for my brother to surface and heard nothing. I panicked and dove down into the water to try and grab him. Just as I dove, I felt his leg brush up against my hand and realized he was about to surface. I swam up again and heard my brother. He was crying and kept saying that his arm hit a rock and that he couldn't feel it. The men above were laughing again, and I heard one of them say, "They fucking made it, those pussies." I then heard objects splashing in the water around us and realized they were throwing beer bottles or rocks or something hard at us. I quickly grabbed my brother by his shirt and helped him swim to the nearby shore from my memory of where it was. The whole time we swam, many objects landed dangerously close to us, and I felt that if any had hit us, it would have caused death or great bodily harm to us, especially if we were hit in the head. My flashlight had been lost in the fall, and we were in complete darkness. We reached the water's edge, and I pulled my brother to the shore. Objects continued to rain down on us, and we could hear the men yelling and laughing. I told my brother that we needed to run. He was crying and holding his injured arm that he could still not feel or use. It had a deep cut around the elbow, and even with just the starlight, we could see it was a serious injury. We stumbled down the tree line and began making our way through the darkness to one of the main trails whose location I remember from past memory. We fell again and again and were cut by branches and rocks all over our bodies as we wandered about down the overgrown trail. Everything in my body told me to keep going and to get as far away from these men as we could. We walked for many minutes until we could no longer hear the men, and then we waited. I wrapped my brother's arm with my shirt and told him that it was over and that all we had to do now was wait until morning for help. We sat in that spot all night, and my brother cried and shook for hours. I just put my arm around him and patted his head as I did when we were children, whenever he would have a panic attack and our parents were not around. At daybreak, we could finally see the severity of his injuries. He had a deep gash on his arm, and his shoulder was obviously dislocated. I helped him hike up the nearby trail, and we walked all the way back to the base camp ranger station. We explained what happened to the rangers, and they sent 2 armed officers to go and investigate the location. My brother was sent to a nearby hospital for treatment, and I joined him on the ambulance ride over. The rangers and police never found the men, but did retrieve most of our gear. The scary thing about this incident is that the same week, 2 teenage boys were found dead at the bottom of the gorge jumping area, and their group had encountered a group of people, as we did at their camping location, with similar machete objects who chased them off their camping spot. I am glad to be alive, and my brother and I have never gone camping again alone or have been back to that location. All we have left from that incident are the scars on my brother's arm, hospital bills, and a lot of trauma. As for the teenage boys, I can only hope that their deaths were accidents, as the authorities ruled. I did not find out about their deaths until 7 years after, but I was horrified about the similar circumstances and timing of the 2 events. As to the men that forced us to jump that day, let's not meet again.